provocateur.media.
Kellyanne Conway. I've been watching that woman go on CNN and other forums, and I have to say, I've been a lawyer for over 35 years, and I don't think I could take that woman down. And I've taken down some amazing people. I've pleaded before the 9 judges of the Supreme Court of Canada. I don't think I could take her down.
Do you know how she was trained?
What, as a lawyer?
That's right.
Well, there you go. See, there is something basically psychotic about our profession. I've always thought so.
I think about it.
I think you're trying to say psychopathic.
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater Dubé, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater Dubé, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
Welcome to episode number 6 of the Goldwaters. Hello, Goldwaters.
Hi, Dan.
Hi, Dan.
Hi, Dan.
First, we have Mate Anne-France Goldwater, senior partner at Goldwater Dubé and political commentator, Dr. Samantha Goldwater Adler, clinical psychologist, and Maître Daniel Goldwater, attorney as well at Goldwater Dubé, here to comment on current events, drawing on both their professional experience and the trademark Goldwater wit. And today we're going to break open the news, guys, the thing that we use to research this program. Can we trust all of the sources of news anymore these days?
Absolutely everyone. Anything you read on the internet, if it's written down, it has to be true, right?
I think so. Everything on the internet is true.
Everything.
What is truth?
Well, if I say something out loud, we don't know if it's true, but if I write it down on paper, and especially if I publish it online, then for sure, that adds credibility.
Well, according to Kellyanne Conway, lest we forget, if Donald Trump says something or writes something down, you must presume it's true unless you can disprove the truthiness of what he has said. That's the standard now. I'm dying to try to apply that standard in a courtroom.
And of course, according to the White House press secretary, there are facts, and then there are alternative facts. So you have a lot of room, really.
That's Kellyanne's invention, too, and I happen to think she's going to go down in history. I think we're never going to make her live down that expression, kind of like when you're stopped driving drunk and the police officer says, "You're driving drunk." You say, "No, police officer, I was just alternative sober."
I don't know why you guys are so concerned with facts altogether. Feelings are far more important.
Yes, my son, the provocateur.
So we're going to talk about generally the state of media on the program today, and we'll talk a bit about spying on journalists, which is something that came up here in Canada recently, in Quebec. But first, let's kick it off with fake news and alternative facts and so forth. It's interesting how fake news these days is often in the eye of the beholder. President Trump considering CNN perhaps as fake news. So we live in strange times, and it's hard for the public to even trust traditionally reliable sources of information. How are media consumers supposed to know what is true anymore?
Well, I think I want to start off and tackle that one. I'm older than all of y'all, and I have the experience of having read garbage papers running from the National Enquirer to Allo Police, the local rag. And, the notion that aliens have invaded Washington and taken over, and communists have infiltrated California, and our drinking water is being poisoned, and all the garbage that was out there in the 60s and the 70s always had an audience. And I suppose that the people who read that stuff believed it. Now, that continues in today's world. There are still people who believe that vaccines cause autism, and it's a disturbing number of people, and it's a public health issue. But I think that what's concerning people is the new vehicle of the internet, the fact that Facebook and Google make the propagation of this garbage easier. And where I'd like to start, actually, is to challenge the expression fake news. I think it's an oxymoron. There is only news. News can only be real. Reality is real. Existence exists. If we don't start there, then we're not talking the same language. So I think that we should rebrand fake news and just call it for what it is, garbage, or with my preference personally is hillbilly garbage.
Whoa. Well, first of all, fake news, there's always been slant in news, right? I mean, we could all, I think, easily identify right-wing, center-wing, and left-wing media news organizations. I wouldn't call them fake news. There's definitely an editorial bias. And I think of, in the current situation, RT, Russia Today, which is essentially a propaganda arm of the Russian government, right? Myself, I was actually kind of fooled by RT, actually. I was on YouTube, and it was showed up in my feed, and it's called RT, not Russia Today. I thought it was like Reuters new brand or something, and I listened to it, and there's a British fella who is speaking. Oh, he's British. And the news was real news. It just had a slant. And then I started to unpack this, and I found, okay, this is Russia Today. Okay, it's funded by the Russian government. I'm like, wait a minute, what about CBC? That's
Funded by the Russian government as well, obviously.
Exactly,
Clearly.
and rife with communists. No, I'm teasing.
CBC is funded by the Canadian government and is rife with communists. I would say that. We can talk about media bias, of course, Daniel, but I've always thought that's why it's important to read different newspapers. I take the National Post for my right-wing point of view, or La Presse, and then I would take, let's say, Le Devoir, or the Washington Post, or The Guardian, or Figaro from my left-wing perspective, and then I try a little more middle-of-the-road stuff like the Gazette and the New York Times and the Globe and Mail, and I kind of glue it all together, and it permits me to edit out what might be a little bit of subjectivity or a little bit of slanting, a little bit of bias, and I can come to a nice middle picture. But this is based on a reasonable trust I have in the journalists who are doing the reporting, who have been trained to do their best to report as objectively as possible. That's not fake news.
Yeah, but that takes a lot of time and effort. Not everyone has it like you do, and a lot of people are politically apathetic as well. And I think a lot of the information that filters into people's brains is really just the path of least resistance. The first thing they see, user experience, what's on your landing page. So I just would warn myself or anybody to project your own habits onto other people.
I totally agree. There's a certain extent to which the first thing there's something called confirmation bias, that when we believe something and then we see something that supports what we believe, we're more likely to buy into it, whether it's true or not. And that's where, Stephen Colbert was so brilliant years ago when he came up with truthiness as an expression. So if it seems true-ish, seems truthy, then when we see it in our social media feed or when someone tells us about it, then we're likely to believe it. And I think it's a fantastic strategy to read a bunch of different sources. There's all sorts of great, fact-checking sites online that you can check into, like Snopes. You can even look up some of the sources or quotes or figures that are given in a study. But frankly, most people aren't going to do these things. And the people that are inclined to do those things aren't the ones who are going to be reading the fake news to begin with.
Exactly.
But I'm going to tell you, because I can pinpoint when this started. The internet has always been a festering swamp of garbage.
You mean pornography and lolcats?
Well, pornography and lolcats already is the good part of the interweb, and what made it grow so huge.
So
but I'm talking the other stuff.
That's the reputable part?
But that being said, I can pinpoint when it started. It started with those emails that we would all get, and I don't mean
chainmails.
Yeah, I don't mean the breast enlarging or penis enlarging emails. I mean the fake news emails, like Dennis Quaid just said this, and I'm not trying to insult Dennis Quaid, and there would be some political screed. He would have said something either pro-American or anti-Muslim or pro-Israel or anti-capitalism. It doesn't matter. Pick your political flavor. They would attach this to a popular figure and pretend so-and-so had said this or the government had done something. And then people, credulous people, and that's most people, this is just not a phenomenon that applies to the uneducated, would then pass these along. I have a close friend, you know him well. He would send me these emails regularly because he'd be so thrilled when he would read something that he thought reflected a common political opinion that we might have.
Thus confirmation bias.
That's why I'm affirming what you're saying, and exactly what I would do would take me a tenth of a second. I would look up exactly what it was on Snopes, because often these kinds of emails had, in the day, a bit of truthiness to them. You look it up on Snopes, well, in today's world, we also have PolitiFacts, but in the day, and some of the stories were true, but the grand majority were garbage and were easily debunked. And then, because these are chain mails or mails that are being distributed to a lot of people, I would do a group reply and say here, and then I would do, as you said, provide other sources and other websites, including obviously Snopes, to show that this information that's being propagated amongst like-minded people was garbage.
thus making you extremely popular in the group, no doubt.
Clearly, I often got some pretty aggressive replies. And they would insist, how can we trust the debunking sites?
Yeah, but Mom, you have the strength of character to be contrarian in a way that other people don't. And it takes a lot of courage to do that and to face maybe...
retribution and rejection and criticism.
Right. And also, this example of this friend who sends these chain mails is that it also underscores how news is entertainment. And I find that that's often lost in a lot of discussions, that people read the news and they talk about it, and I wonder, like, what is your intention in reading this? Are you a municipal councillor? Are you involved in this industry? We're talking about it for filler, really, because it's a common thing to discuss because we know other people read the same stuff.
But what type of news are you talking about? You're making some real generalizations about what kind of news? Political news, corporate news?
I think all news. I think, Daniel, you're really on point. And I think that, when we talk about fake news, I think one of the most dangerous parts is that even in the mainstream media or the non-fake news category, then a lot of news stories are presented for entertainment, that they're slanted in such a way, they have catchy titles, they have catchy pictures, they're somewhat inflammatory, just to get us, it's clickbait. So we can click, so we can talk about it, so we can feel morally vindicated and outraged, and we can talk to each other. And when you're saying what type of news, look, as soon as we get something, we'll all talk about Trump. Trump is clickbait. That's, I think, partly how he got so much free advertising and free marketing to become president, is because he would say such inflammatory stuff. They dominated the news cycle because he was interesting to talk about, and everyone loved to be outraged by him. And then, of course, all the celebrity trash, gossip. But yeah, I think, Daniel, you have a fantastic point, and I think that news as entertainment is one of the biggest issues when we're talking about real news and fake news.
And one of the problems also I find that this creates is I've noticed in my life when I talk to people about the news, it's like, how deep do you want to penetrate this issue? How granular do you want to get? And I've noticed that people just lose patience. They don't have the stamina. You start talking about whatever issue came up in the news, and maybe you could literally set like a 2-minute timer until no one's interested in talking about it anymore. I'm like, so then why did we start talking about this?
So we can nod and feel connected to each other, and we can feel some sort of, social solidarity. Like, okay, we're all part of the same tribe. All right, got it, confirmed, check. Now let's go have go have coffee.
I want to note that this generational change may also be part of the problem because, you talk about news being a function of entertainment and clickbait. And I'm thinking, clickbait? I don't know what clickbait is, but news for me involves picking up the Sunday Times that's several hundred pages long and sitting quietly and reading for hours and hours and hours. And then the notion of news as entertainment also perplexed me because, well, what is news? News has to be something sudden and unexpected. It's the things that happen every day. The mayor woke up this morning and went to work is not news, right?
Depends which mayor.
But, a dog bites a child. Well, that's not news. But in Montreal, if the dog resembles a pit bull, suddenly it's headline news, and there's radio programs and call-in shows and television headlines. And I had in this last week, in fact, to do a number of interviews where I had to explain to reporters a dog biting a child is not news. It is a common event. There's a current hysteria. You remember, for instance, that there was a hysteria at a certain time about ritual satanic abuse going on in daycares around North America. This was completely made-up garbage.
I see two issues here. There's sensational news and fake news. When does sensational news or tabloid news become fake news? And how can you tell when you've crossed that line?
I think it has to do with intent. I mean, is there an intent to deceive? And is that intention to deceive, is it past a threshold where it's become unreasonable? Because when, even Dan, with that distinction, the first thought that I had, isn't all news inherently sensational? When
yes.
When's it ever been otherwise?
Well, you see, again, I still think that's a generational divide. I mean, I've always found it very important to read about the federal government's treaty commitments to Native peoples in Canada. There's nothing
also
exciting.
a lawyer.
Well, I'm a lawyer. I'm interested in how all peoples in my larger community are faring, and knowing how an oppressed people, like Native peoples in this country, how their rights are being advanced through political discussion interests me. Sure, as a lawyer, I've had training reading the judgments, but for me, news doesn't have to have this element of titillation, of sensationalism to capture my attention. I know that what makes me different. But I think if there's certainly a problem in the United States, is a failure for them as a larger community to invest in education. I think the educational factor is grossly understated. There was a study that was just done by the Stanford Graduate School of Education where they took children at all ages, middle school, high school. So middle school, I guess, must be about 11, 12-year-olds in the States, high school and college-age students, to assess what is their ability to judge the credibility of information they read online. And they were very distressed to discover that even if a teenager reads a website and sees there is a link to another page called sponsored content, that child of the age of reason as a teenager doesn't understand that means that it's paid for content. It's not journalistic content. It's not content with integrity. And I think that there was a time where if you were educated, you had to make an effort to go out and buy an interesting paper. Let's say if I'd go and buy the Village Voice, a paper I haven't seen in a long time, that was also quite hard left, but I loved it because of the erudition of the writing. I would drink it in like I drink in Le Devoir. It's not because it's a different political opinion from mine that I didn't love the quality of the journalism. But in today's world, you don't even have to pay for a subscription to a paper to come to your door. You sit at your screen in your underwear in your basement, middle of the night, and this garbage that comes to you, free and unfiltered, and you have no way to gauge the credibility of what that information is. And if the schools have not picked up the challenge, they pointed out in this article that was credible, that a lot of schools are still using a curriculum that was developed in 1999 about online information that is woefully out of date in the year 2016, 2017.
I also looked at that Stanford study, and what I couldn't find, maybe you did, you're a better reader than I, clearly, is I did not find that there was any comparative baseline. I mean, have middle schoolers gone down in their ability to suss out the truth? I don't know. Would I trust a middle schooler before the internet to suss out what's a good source? No. My academic career, I can say, the only time that really everything came together was when I went to university, and it was all about the evaluation of sources. That's essentially all I learned in higher education. I think that embracing ambiguity and ranking truthiness is the key to intellect. And that only comes about late in life, I think, if at all.
Yes, and I think frankly the generational difference is a red herring. Unless we have a time machine and we can retransport the world to the good old days of milkshakes and more explicit racism, then I don't see the point in comparing across generations. We're relegated today.
Vanilla milkshakes or chocolate milkshakes?
Well, it depends.
Swirl.
There we go. I think that there's a problem going on right now. We need to see what it is. And to address Dan's former question, I think that the difference between sensational news and fake news is that sensational news is still based on fact. There's some trivial fact. It could be the local kid who gets bitten by a pit bull type dog, and that becomes sensationalized because it's still a fact and it's being blown out of proportion, let's say. Fake news is fake. It is not based on fact. It's based on just whatever it is that people think will titillate and convince and draw in the audience. And in terms of kids and in terms of education, I think that it's imperative that I've been going on this for many years now, that I think it's imperative that our education system really teach critical thinking skills. Frankly, one of the best classes I've ever taken in my life, and I've been in school for a long, long time. I did a PhD. I was in school many, many, many years. And frankly, one of the best classes I ever took was in CEGEP at Marianopolis by Dr. Bailey, and it was a course called Argument and Propaganda. And she was a lawyer. It was a fantastic course, and she really taught about all the different fallacies, so what made things illogical and what made things logical. And what was even more brilliant about the course is that so besides teaching us, the basic content, all the examples she gave were real life examples from advertising advertisements, political quotes. And our task was to look at these quotes and be able to analyze them and say, is this logical? Is this false? And if it's false, what type of false? And how can you make it logical?
Here, here. And my favorite course was also in CEGEP, and it was all the same type of course on critical thinking, where we were inundated with materials and had to learn the difference between generalizations, low-order observations, learning the difference between misinterpretation of statistics and proper interpretation of statistics. And, CEGEP is not that advanced a level of education. For people who listen to us outside the province, this is sort of what you get in grade 12. So you're still at the level of what a high school education should be. And I think that is an awesome age for critical thinking. I think we could be starting a little sooner, Lord knows.
I think that we should be planting these seeds much sooner, because critical thinking is not something that spontaneously generates in college years or amongst the higher educated. I think that you can still develop those skills very early on. I just think that at least rudimentary skills, and kind of build on them, teach kids to question rather than merely defer to authority. But that said, do I think that this is actually, as I say this, I feel a pain in my heart, because I don't think that any of this is actually going to be done. The education system is already overburdened. There's already all sorts of issues in terms of what's being taught and the number of hours, the amount of homework the kids are being given. So do I think that realistic?
Not enough.
Not enough. Too much. Whatever.
I'm really not as pessimistic as you guys. No, I was
grunted.
I wanted to make a point.
It
wasn't a grunt. It was a sigh. But I sigh just because, and it's going to sound like what it sounds like, but I find that once you learn these skills you described, Samantha, in CEGEP, where you're able to unpack the truth and problematize your sources, the irony is that you start to realize that most everything you were taught before was not exactly true.
Yes, which
what,
was
calculus, vector algebra.
That's what I learned before grade 12. Thank you.
Vector algebra. Yes, as we all did.
We did. We did. I'm going for CEGEP level courses.
But I think that that's one of the bigger issues as well. Is that when we teach as parents, as educators, when we teach kids, we're often not really focused on teaching kids how to acquire information, how to evaluate information, how to tell, truth from bunk. What we're trying to teach them is we have to stuff as many facts from this textbook in your head as possible. And this is not to minimize the work of teachers. Teachers are one of the most important industries and professions in our society. And some are really, really phenomenal. So it's not to minimize the work that they do.
Yeah, but
I just think that a lot of the focus, even as parents, a lot of the lines that we give kids, so kids will ask us why something is as it is. And we say, well, it just is.
What do you make of the impact that fake news had on the election? So we have a couple of sources competing here. One study says that it didn't. BuzzFeed did a study that says that it did, pointing to some social media metrics that show that fake news overtook real news on Facebook in the last days of the election. Do you think that fake news really swayed the election in Trump's favor?
No. I think that there are just way too many factors. The margins, the difference between what got him elected and the turnout for Hillary was so narrow. And if you're it's impossible to say. I mean, there was the James Comey affair. There was the fact that she didn't stump very hard in the Rust Belt. I mean, who's to blame? I don't know. There are many factors. So it's impossible to answer that question with any confidence.
I can answer that question.
Of course, you
can answer any question with confidence
because I am your mother.
Because you're a lawyer.
I'm always right.
Obviously.
No. This I'm taking maternal priority here. This is my prerogative.
All moms are always right.
43% of Americans eligible to vote turned out for what is probably the most important election of modern times. And if only 43% of the American electorate could turn out with the flood of information and disinformation out there, so not just the newspapers and television and radio and faxes for all I know, but also social media, and even then, only 43% of the citizens, adult citizens of the greatest democracy that has ever existed, could be bothered to get their butts out of the house and vote. What that tells me is something more important than whether the Donald got into power or Hillary. What it did tell me is that there's we may be facing the death knell of democracy. I think the basic level of the quality of education and the civic engagement of citizens in a democracy has declined so sharply in the modern era that I despair as to what government is going to look like in the years to come. You know, certainly the election of the Donald has become an impetus for the garbage in Europe, the great cemetery of Europe, to put forward candidates that are ever further to the right.
I think Europe was leading the way in this case.
Originally,
for many years.
I totally agree with you, but now it's sort of flipped around. I think the devil spawn of the Le Pen family are going to continue to make inroads in France. What's going to happen to Angela Merkel, I don't know. I mean, for me to say this is the last light, the last bastion of democracy.
It's an interesting world where Angela Merkel, which is great, the leader of Germany, right? And then the snowboarding, pot-smoking leader of Canada, Justin Trudeau, are the bastions of liberal democracy in the world.
It's kind of scary. And for all that I keep denigrating our pot-smoking topless Justine, I'm less down on him now when I look at what's just to the south of us. But I think that we may have to rethink how we choose our leaders in the future, because if that social contract is failing and if citizens are not willing to participate in a democracy, we have a problem. I mean, we have a problem that far transcends these horrendous executive orders that Trump is signing every day.
But I think it's important to meditate on why the turnout was so low, especially given how polarized it was, especially given that when Obama had run, there was, I believe, it was one of the highest turnouts comparatively. I think at least his first term. I have to double check that. So, but that being the case, my understanding is why so few people showed up for Hillary was because of the polls, because the polls were so certain. So the apathy had to do with the fact that they're like, well, she's a shoo-in. And I think that was a big element.
I think that was a big element. But as you say, the American election was multifactorial. There was so many different things that were coming into play that It's hard to say. There was a lot of Republican efforts to stop the vote, to prevent certain people from being able to vote. That really did, have a marked effect. I'm not sure if it swayed the election, but it was a factor that came into play. And I think fundamentally, a lot of people didn't like Hillary and didn't trust Hillary. I think one of the bigger issues, one of the core issues that's coming in, I think this sort of feeds into the fake news, is that there's been a crisis in terms of trust in authority and in terms of trust of our government. And so when you're saying there's decreased civic participation and people they're not voting as much and they're not as interested, I think people are still interested in what's happening. They just don't trust them. So even if we just don't trust our local politicians. And so it becomes, most people, if I ask, did you vote? The ones that say they didn't, because they say, well, I didn't think it would make a difference. So even when people say that they voted, let's say, for Justin Trudeau, a lot of people liked what Justin Trudeau had to say. He said all the right things. He's in a nice package saying nice things that really, appeal to liberals. But a lot of people, a lot of liberals, and frankly, rightly said, well, we don't think he's actually going to follow through.
Wow. I don't know how I managed to raise in the same house a communist, that's the child to the left,
who is not remotely a communist,
and a fascist, the child to the right. But it's nice to know the fascist has repudiated.
I'm not a fascist. I've actually been very intellectually consistent. I've always been a socialist. The neocons were socialists in disguise. People know about this. People who know about this. I'm a Bernie man. I think that, to your point, Samantha, earlier about blaming this as more of a systemic issue of people not voting and have certain apathy towards government, I think that point is a bit overstated. I think that leaders make all the difference. And I think that guy like Bernie Sanders, he had amazing turnout. When he was stumping, when you look at how many people were donating money to him, people who are traditionally apathetic, young people, I blame the Democratic Party.
Well, but I think that you're touching on something very important, and I think part of the reason we've had discussions about this before, and that I think that, frankly, that Bernie Sanders and Trump were riding on the same wave as Obama to a certain extent, which is we do not trust our local political institutions. We don't trust politicians. We don't trust government. I think this extends to news because it becomes, well, we don't trust any sort of establishment. We don't believe what they have to say. They say one thing, but they do something entirely different. And that's thus the hunger for change, for outsiders.
But wait, slow down. Obama never campaigned on distrust, okay?
Obama campaigned on change.
Sure he did.
And he was an outsider. That was still the point.
100% an outsider.
And that's what
Naturally.
people got so motivated and excited by. And frankly, some of the disillusionment with Obama over time and into the second term was this thought of, oh, maybe he's just a politician like everyone else. And that's what really stung a lot of the people who were so motivated and so excited who voted for him initially.
It's a
And
cliche
because
of electoral.
when-
Hold on, it's a cliche of electoral politics to run on a campaign based on change. He made it more center stage in the branding, and I'll give you that. But I think that it's what he had more was grace and speaking to the American people in a conciliatory fashion and with an oratory that was unparalleled in recent American history. And I admire him.
Come on. You
No,
think
for
his
true.
oratory appealed to anybody?
Barack Obama, yes.
Other than us?
I mean,
are you
you
kidding
know,
me?
that's so classist
no,
of you.
No,
What do you
it's
mean?
not classist. It's
us.
educational status.
You think
Not
people
at
without
all.
education were not inspired by Barack Obama?
I think people were extremely inspired by Barack Obama and, frankly, Michelle Obama, who's also a brilliant orator.
I totally agree with Samantha. People were inspired by a man who had no political experience. At the most, he was a community organizer, which was part of my concern about his ability to assume the position he did. He was totally an outsider. He spoke about change. He was inspiring. The idea of a post-racial America, this chimera of a dream. I mean, we all believed in the dream at the time. Now look what's happened. But at the end of the day, he succumbed to something that Trump will not succumb to. Trump, the man I hate, let's understand each other, is he could not break gridlock because he did try to work within the conventions of the structure of American democracy. And that's what people don't want anymore. They want creative destruction.
Yes.
And
I think
that's why they voted for Trump at the end of the day. That's what he's delivering to the people. You have to admit he's being true to his word. That already makes him different from a conventional politician. He said, I'm going to come in and turn everything upside down and manifest my hatred for the entire rest of the planet, my distrust of science, my hatred of the Mexicans, my hatred of women. I don't know if he's done the hatred of women yet. He'll get, oh yeah, of course, he wants to restrict abortion rights and be sure he names a Supreme Court justice who probably have a track record like his, be anti-abortion while grabbing pussies. So that being said, he's delivering on his agenda, and he's not doing it by trying to engage in actual democratic government and respecting the institutions, but rather just by signing a series of executive orders. It's kind of fascinating. But we are witnessing a president who's trying to destroy democracy. Did he ride there on the coattails of fake news? Well, I certainly think that Facebook and Google are doing a lot of soul searching right now. And I read some interesting articles wherein they recognize that they may have to change how their internal artificial intelligence works. You know, we did do a podcast on artificial intelligence, and here's the something we didn't even think of at the time, which is that the search algorithms on Facebook and Google are such that the entirely amoral software, which is applying early stages of artificial intelligence to figure out what you're looking for, is promoting fake news unintentionally. And that has two terrible results. It's bringing more garbage to people who are vulnerable to believe the garbage they're reading. And in addition, it's raising revenues for the people who are publishing these garbage sites that are full of ads, and there's advertising revenues being created. And if you host a site where advertisers appear on your page and get clicks, well, you're making money. So, of course, if Facebook and Google are interested in maintaining and upholding the values of democracy, they're going to have to do something. And here's where you get to the real philosophically tricky issue. See, I don't believe in censorship. And I would not want Facebook and Google to wipe out the garbage. But they might have to put a warning like we do on X-rated films and say, what this website is garbage. Or please check the following fact-checking sites, like we said, Snopes or PolitiFact.
And they're both proposing taking those initiatives. So
but
having
these are essential initiatives, because the people out there past the age of 18, no longer in school, no longer getting an education, many who have very limited educations, as we know, need to have something that comes into their faces and cautions them that what they're reading is not fact.
Well, look, I think that's very important. I think that the initiatives that Facebook and Google are proposing, I think that they sound really exciting. They sound really interesting. I have the slightly disturbed in the back of my mind that it has to be these multinational, multi-billion-dollar corporations that are ones who are going to make these decisions and are responsible for kind of our social welfare and political activism. There's something about that disturbs me a bit.
The New York Times or the Washington Post does it, what's the difference?
They have a different agenda.
It's a venue for journalists. You know what has worried me? If, as a lawyer, and who lives in a big democracy, Canada, the role of journalists, the concept of freedom of expression and freedom of the press and the protection of journalists, and the role journalists have of being the educators of the public after the public's finished with their school teachers, is so sacrosanct in a democracy that I've been terrified about the loss of job opportunities for journalists in a world where print journalism is dying. Absolutely. So the idea that venues like Google and Facebook are going to have to, in my opinion, this is your mom speaking, now hire entire classes of journalism students to come in there and do that fact-checking, we are going to bring to these corporations the very integrity that makes us trust the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Globe and Mail, the National Post and the Presse and the Devoir and so on.
I think one of the very important things is that, yes, I think that these are great initiatives. We'll see how it actually pans out. There's always a big difference between what people say they're going to do and what the unintended consequences are, what they actually end up doing or what the consequences are. I think that one of the things that I hear in this conversation that I find disturbing and I think has been a factor in terms of people's political activism and in terms of the proliferation of hate news, of fake news, is that a lot of people are fed up of being condescended to. And they don't want to be told that, oh, you're the uneducated ones, you're the ones who are out working like the Joe Schmo jobs, or you're the hillbillies. And so we as the elite, as the educated elite, we need to come and we need to save you from yourselves. And there's something that hurts my soul. And I think that a lot of people, of course it doesn't. I think a lot of people, frankly, and this is going to come as a major shock to you, I'm sure, people don't like being condescended to.
Okay.
Wait. And also another thing. You've spoken, and you could answer. You remember, you're a lawyer. I'll just say that let's just not also exaggerate the effect size of fake news. I think this has gotten a little lost in the discussion. I don't know how urgent it is that Google start flagging sites. And as you kind of hinted at, Samantha, I'm also very suspicious of how that would play out. I don't know if I trust. Who would you trust to decide what you should be reading or what is the right thing to read? It leads inherently to sort of thought crime type of territory.
Let's get to the state of news media organizations. So they're getting it from both sides. They have to compete against fake news and that sort of precarious battle for the truth. And on the other side, sometimes they're getting it from government and the judiciary as well. We had a couple of spygates here in Quebec, as well as issues with governments around the world spying on journalists and media organizations. It was discovered here in Quebec that journalist Patrick Lagacegate, among others, was being spied on by Montreal police, acting legally with over 20 warrants signed by judges. The Quebec government saying it wants to make it more difficult to get a search warrant targeting journalists to raise the bar a bit higher, on par with lawyers and judges. But how were Montreal police able to obtain, and France, let's start with you maybe, on these warrants in the first place? And what does this say about the precarious state of our media protecting some of its most valuable information?
First of all, the story was hugely shocking when it came out, and the more we learned the details, the more shocking it became. So let me give you a little bit of a background, because not everybody knows what goes on locally here in Montreal. Patrick Lagacegate is a commentator for Le Presse and has also done other newsy-type TV shows. He's a very respected fellow and writes very well, and I certainly enjoy interviews that I've done with him. Now, in this particular case, the Montreal police were investigating one of their own officers, and to protect the fellow's presumption of innocence, I will not mention his name. And the concern they had is that this sergeant detective was planting heroin on suspects, falsifying information he was getting from informants, and violating policies on handling confidential information. And also, for fun, he also attended massage parlors. I kind of rolled my eyes how we went from heroin to massage parlors, but what the hell. So he was arrested last July and charged with obstruction of justice, amongst other charges. Now, the police had a wiretap on his phone, and that's fine. That's part of their investigation against one of their own with respect to very serious wrongdoing, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for the fact that police would take very seriously investigating criminal conduct in the absence of integrity of one of their own officers. So far, so good. Like, I'm pleased with what they were doing as a jurist. But then, as it turns out, this particular police officer was having a number of conversations with Patrick Lagacegate. And so was he leaking information about himself or about the functioning of the department? That I don't know. But we do know that apparently there were a total of 85 telephone calls between him and Lagacegate. And this they would have had as information from the wiretap of the police officer they were investigating. So here's the deal. On 24 separate occasions, they got warrants, authorizations to tap Patrick Lagacegate, the journalist, telephone. Was there any investigative justification for taking this step? Because there's a standard that's been set by our Supreme Court that says you must weigh the harm that would be caused to the freedom of the press, because journalists have to be able to speak to sources on a confidential basis. It's not a blanket constitutional protection, but it's an important constitutional value. And you have to weigh that against the necessity of the investigation of a crime. And the Supreme Court expects that a justice of the peace, who's not a judge of the superior courts, a lower level judge, a lower level magistrate, is going to do that balancing before authorizing such a wiretap. Otherwise, why do we bother asking a justice of the peace to authorize the wiretap? Why not just let this be a police state and let police officers tap everybody's phone just for shits and giggles? And yet, the police were never refused the warrant. They were never refused an authorization for the wiretap. They got 24 of them. And these were recently upheld by the courts. There, I completely fell off my chair. And I have huge concerns for the quality of our democracy locally. You see, we don't pay attention to local news, right? We're so captivated by the atrocities going on in Washington.
Thus, news as entertainment.
Yeah,
yes.
Speak for yourself, but go on.
Okay. Did you know that this was all going on, Daniel, before I just explained it?
Yes.
Oh, good man. Good man. Good. Then I'm pleased.
I'm such a redneck, usually.
I look at my hillbilly son. Turns out I raised two communists. Oh, well. So that being said, it's unbelievable, but there are a number of attorneys, including my partner, Maître Marie-Hélène Dubé, including my former prof, Maître Julius Gray, and a number of others, like Professor Turp, who wrote a joint letter, published a joint letter in La Presse to explain to the public how dangerous it is if the courts uphold and permit the police officers to use investigative techniques that breach so cavalierly the importance of the confidentiality of journalists' investigations and the protection of their sources in the context of their confidential information. So, when we make fun of the Americans and their wholesale attack on the media, we don't exactly have clean hands in this debate.
Yeah, but the huge jurisprudential principles that were not necessarily followed here, of course, is a animating, a foundational factor here. One thing that I was really taken by in some of the things I read for this was Maître Jeffrey Burrow, who is a criminalist, a criminal defense attorney in Montreal. And he had said, when he was interviewed about this, he said, quote, "Usually police know which justice to go see if they want to have a liberal interpretation of what it is they want to know." So it comes down to picking your judges. And I have to say, it goes on. It goes on in the legal community. You know generally which judges will maybe lean on this side, maybe lean on that side. And it's an obstruction of, it's horrible. I mean, it's actually runs completely counter to fundamental principles of justice, and practitioners do it all the time.
Where I would agree with you, actually, Daniel, is that lawyers in any domain of law know who their good and bad judges are. Certainly among us family law lawyers, we have these are the pink judges, these are the blue judges, and we're not talking about the sex of the judges, but they're which way they lean, pro-man, pro-woman, or pro-father, pro-mother, as you might view it. And I do remember, as soon as you started talking about that, I remember being a much younger lawyer, and I did a fair bit of criminal law back in the day, and I remember in the day how much easier it was to get an acquittal from a judge who had been a former defense attorney than a judge who had been a former crown prosecutor. And they pointed out in the Lagacegate affair that the justice of the peace who had signed at least the warrant that was attacked before the courts was a justice of the peace who had been a former crown prosecutor. So obviously, your training, your past experience inform the attitude you're going to bring if you're then promoted to a judge. And as a judge, you have a huge role in governance of society, just as politicians have a huge role in governance of society. I note as well that the Annie Sampson, the chairman of the city's public security committee, and who also has an ignoble track record, in my opinion, her attitude towards dogs, I had to throw that in, as an animal rights activist, also said that she was quite satisfied by whatever explanations she got from the Montreal police force behind closed doors, information not shared with the public. And this is despite the fact that the police admitted quite candidly that they don't have an internal policy as to what standard they need to establish in order to justify an investigation involving a journalist. So it means they don't have their own internal controls and rules, and yet here are the city of Montreal thinks it's perfectly fine and perfectly kosher for them to have gone after this journalist in a very aggressive fashion, a very respected, serious journalist, not of the fake news persuasion, the real news persuasion, in this way. And so what I feel is, I hear you, Samantha, when you say there's the loss of trust in institutions, but it's you have to weigh it against the fact that up until the internet, how institutions were being run and how decisions were being made, the idea of the discussions that go on behind closed doors and the backroom deals, that was the standard. In today's world, we've blown open, I'm sure it's going to bring us to WikiLeaks at some point, we've blown open how the courts work and how the police force works and how our governments are run.
And oftentimes we're not so happy with what we see when it's blown open.
We certainly aren't, but
you know what this all argues for, rather funnily?
What?
Bots. We need bots in the judiciary. I mean, if you think about it...
Drones.
Yeah, it would be nice to eliminate judicial bias by having bots maybe making all the judgments for us. But that being said, one thing that we haven't actually mentioned in all this, the sort of greater scandal to me in all this, is the real background to this between Mayor Coderre and Patrick Lagacegate. Patrick Lagacegate in 2014 at some point had done this investigation on whether or not our current mayor, had paid a fine with respect to being...
traffic violation.
Wasn't a traffic violation.
Parking ticket?
No. It had to... Mom, you should read more. It has to do... It had to do with whether or not...
The egg is about to be crushed by the chicken.
Yeah, but these boomers, they don't really like reading the news.
No, they're just too impulsive. It was about he didn't pay, whether or not he paid a fine with respect to being registered when he was a deputy minister in Ottawa. And Patrick Lagacegate had done some investigations and then sent this email to his press attaché asking for a comment on this. And he was actually satisfied because a high-ranking police officer had confirmed, no, he did pay the fine, and so he didn't run with the story. And then the weirdness of this all is then a few months later, there's this tapping that's going on of Lagacege's phone, which, as you already went on about, and you were very on that, is that it seems at face value completely unnecessary. They were already tapping and following the corrupt cop, and this to me is the real crisis of confidence that really shocks me to my core. And it reminds me, and I hate to get more dramatic about this, but there's something Duplessis-ish about it. It reminds me of my favorite judgment that I had to study in law school was Roncarelli contre Duplessis. This is a fundamental case in the history of our constitutional law, the principle of the rule of law. This was during La Grande Noirceur. This is when Maurice Duplessis, a Catholic hard-right premier, was running the province and was something of an autocrat. And he was very hostile to this Jehovah's Witness fellow who was running a restaurant. And this fellow was denied an application for a bar license, personally by Duplessis.
A liquor license.
Liquor license, right, to be more specific.
Which is fatal for a restaurant.
Voila. And it went up the courts, and then the judgment, the ratio, was that there is a rule of law in this province, and there's no person that is above it. It almost brings me to tears.
Let's talk about the foot soldiers of fake news, trolls, and people who are, I guess, how do you define trolls? People who are online, engaging in very aggressive dissemination of their perspectives, often questionable. So trolls are a problem for news organizations. Do you think trolls are responsible for actually influencing the news? And how can we sort of crack down on the influence that people saying nonsense on the internet have with our news media?
Well, I have a little bit of experience with that because of the number of press journalists, print journalists that I know, like the real McCoy. And I learned years ago from them that you have to stay away from the comments on articles because they said you'd be surprised how there's a very, very small subgroup of the population that trolls the news sites and writes all types of garbage, very aggressive and very hostile garbage. Don't read the comments, stay away. So I learned that long ago, and I don't think there's anything that can or should be done about that. Haters gotta hate. The best thing to do with these people is ignore them. The only time when I think there is a problem is when what these trolls do slips into hate speech and targets groups for hatred, or when there's individual attacks. When there's individual attacks, I think that we have to step up our enforcement of laws that are already on the books to attack these people who seek to attack specific individuals.
I think particularly when it comes to incitation of violence.
Yeah,
I think that that's the bigger concern with trolls. If a troll wants to say that you're ugly, you're fat, he doesn't like your smell, he doesn't like your views, that's one thing. I think ignoring it sounds like a fantastic policy, but when it comes to for a lot of women particularly end up being victim of trolls who will say that they're going to rape them, they're going to kill them, they're going to sexually harm them in many different ways. And I think that that's something that's terrifying. I don't think that's something you can just ignore.
Yeah, but I think I think the greatest threat of trolling, and where I do think intervention is required, I have to tell you, is a trolling that afflicts women as a sex, women as a group, and individual women. And it's not just the threats of violence, it's the threats of disseminating information about the woman, defaming the woman, contacting the woman's family and friends,
or
online
publishing
harassment,
contact information
or
addresses.
Contact information and so on. I think for some reason, I don't know why, the internet seems to be this tremendous venue for men who have, I suppose, relational difficulties with women and think that it's really genial and awesome to attack women as a sex or to attack individual women. I think it's horrendous. I think it's a social catastrophe. And, once we've left the world of political speech and fake news and we go into this attacking women, now we're in a world where I think something has to be done. We've left the world of censorship. I'm against censorship. Now we're talking about a certain number, a small number, I hope, of men who are aggressors and who have to be dealt with.
Yeah, but I can't speak on behalf of women because I'm not a woman. I'm a Jewish man. And in that regard, one of the things I had read in preparation for this was that about 40% of notifications for online hate speech are reviewed in 24 hours on social media, right? And that's only 40%. Maybe it should be more, right? It should be flagged and dealt with earlier. And this was an EU-sponsored study. What they also found were that Jews are the biggest target. And so I have a dog in that fight, and I've always been suspicious.
You have a Jewish dog? What?
I have a circumcised dog in that fight. And I've always been suspicious of hate crime legislation. I've always found it to be inherently problematic. I think that there are already laws on the books against issuing death threats, against incitation to violence against an individual. And I find that it just opens up a door that I'm very uncomfortable with. I mean, it leads to concepts of group crime in one direction or the other. And it opens up this idea that there are certain, that you can be admonished or punished by the state if you say something that is politically...
don't you dare say politically incorrect.
Well,
don't say
hold on.
Don't do it.
David,
Don't do it.
I
Don't
won't
do it.
then, but I will say this. Recall David Irving, who was the Holocaust denier who went to jail in Austria for publishing a well-researched book. I'm not endorsing Holocaust denial. The man was wrong. But he went to jail. Because
that is a good thing.
I disagree.
But we're leaving the world of internet trolling, which is a very specific social phenomenon, but it certainly put a pin in that one. I think we should come back to it. But
then you define a troll. My intention, from what I've understood, what a troll is someone who says something, gives you an opinion with the intention to cause grief.
Let's end with just your one pick for a troll you'd like to give a shout out to. Is there anyone out there, disseminator of trolling or fake news, that you think is particularly noteworthy?
Damn straight. I'm going to start with this one. And I'm going to name Milo Yiannopoulos, who happens to be a Jew. Because, as I understand it, despite the Greek name, means his father's Greek, but his mum is Jewish. It's 100% a Jew. So I therefore challenge you when you say that so many Jews are victims of trolling. But this is a fellow who qualifies as a troll himself for an online article. The solution to online harassment is simple, says Mr. Yiannopoulos. Women should log off. He feels that we women are screwing up the internet for men by invading every space that men have online and ruining it with our attention-seeking and with our needy, demanding, touchy-feely form of modern feminism. Phooey to you, Milo. Be ashamed of yourself.
Well, I'm not exactly sure exactly what a troll is. I mean, and from my readings, it's really just generally a provocateur with an aim to cause grief. And if that's the case, I think that every good thinker has a troll in them somewhere. And I think that the troll just needs to be conditioned, used judiciously, and not step into harassment or bullying. And the person that comes to mind, and it kind of pains me to refer to him as a troll, but with that preamble, Christopher Hitchens is probably my greatest intellectual hero, and he was a polemicist. He was a contrarian. He was the first person to say that. He was branded as such. He played the devil's advocate quite literally with respect to the beatification of Mother Teresa. And I think that he's passed.
I miss him.
I know he's passed, and it's very painful. But I think these people who have contrarian reflexes are some of those valuable people in our society. And it makes us investigate the things we've taken for granted.
Answering who's my favorite troll, that is a tough question. I'm inclined to go with, going by your looser definition, Dale, I'm inclined to go with Penn and Teller. They had a great show called Bullshit, where they would really break things down, break down popular misconceptions and get into the facts. And that show I find degenerated into just basic name calling of people. It was like, well, that person's wrong because they're an a-hole, and that was the extent of their argument. So even though I agreed with them on certain levels, it did fall loosely into the category of trolling. But that said, I'm going to take a step back, and I'm going to represent my daughter, my 5-year-old. I'm going to go with her favorite troll. I'm going to go with Poppy from DreamWorks Trolls. She's a disseminator of hope and faith that people can overcome their difficulties and their cannibalistic ways to be able to come together and dance and sing and bring joy to the world. So I'm going with Poppy from DreamWorks Trolls. That's my favorite.
Literal trolls. Got it.
Beautiful way to end the podcast, Dr. Samantha. Let's also end it with further readings on the state of media and fake news. Daniel, what should we dig into next weekend?
Well, if I had to endorse for the reading, I would just say Clickhole. This is the comedy satirical news site, Onion-esque, that I think just brilliantly skewers internet-era clickbait media like no other.
And I'm going to go with a classic, an old classic. I'm going to go with George Orwell's 1984, because a lot of this discussion as we're talking about this really brings to mind newspeak. And just the idea that the information and the news that you disseminate, if you disseminate it hard enough and what you present can shape the way people think. And if you take away the language of fact or of dissent, then you may take away the thoughts of dissent and of fact. So I'm going George Orwell, 1984, old classic.
Sales have been rising steadily lately, by the way, of 1984. Anne France, your pick?
Or so the news would have you believe.
Good
Do you
one.
see why I love my son?
Is that the only reason?
Probably. What I would recommend actually is a more provocative take, and that's the story the history of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange's contribution to the dissemination of true knowledge with bad intentions, perhaps. And I think that there's good articles available both in the New York Times and for our French listeners at Le Monde, a French from France news site that's just as reputable, and that give you some perspective, because there's bigger issues of morality that you have to explore. When is the dissemination of true information harmful, and do the ends justify the means? The end of disseminating truths justify the means, which is stealing the information.
Join us next time for another episode of The Goldwaters. We'll be adding some very special guests to the program soon, so stay tuned for that. You can listen to past episodes at thegoldwaters.ca and join the conversation on Facebook or Twitter, #TheGoldwaters. I'm your moderator, Dan Delmar. Thank you, Goldwater.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Merci.
That's a wrap.
Great.
Woo, I didn't throw up. Oh my God, you're breathing all your sickness.
I licked all this food, by the way, before putting it out.
Provocateur.media.